Hey there, welcome to dotnetFlix. Today our guest is Henry Bain, and Henry, you're going to talk about Bicep, right? If I'm correct.
Yes, I am. Bicep, the infrastructure as code language
Yes.
for Microsoft Azure, that is, not these things.
No, exactly, yeah. And are you going to talk about 101, like getting started with Bicep, or is it more advanced and next level stuff?
And what I will be talking about is not a 101, and you know this because we talked about this beforehand.
Sure,
I'm
sure.
going to skip the 101 and I'm going to dive into a number of features that have been added in, let's say, the last 12 to 18 months
Hmm.
to get you up to date if you're already
Cool.
a Bicep user with what's been happening.
Yeah, I'm curious. So let's take it away.
And like any decent presenter, I'm going to start with some slides. If you're wondering who I am, my name is Henry Bain. I am a developer and architect from the Netherlands. If you want to get in contact, have feedback, positive or something that I can improve, feel free to reach out. But instead of sharing my professional career, I want to share something about myself. If you're interested in who I am, one of the things that I did, I think about 3 years ago, is buy a very ugly house in a fantastic location on the island of Texel. And we started a big renovation with the contractor. And the first thing he did, he was removing all the text from the house. Um, and this was more, I think, like 3 years ago, what we felt like was going to be a rock bottom in taking down the old house and before starting to build it up. But unfortunately, it got worse. This is the other
Wow.
side of the house 2 weeks later. So this is now actually a new wall, which is the wall you're seeing behind me, and we're a
Wow.
little bit further in time now. But one of the things I did was I've kicked out the contractor once the rough build was done, and I'm myself building the finishing of the house, so all the
Mm,
installation work, all the internal walls, everything else. So
wow.
I've been doing that for I think a year and a half now, since I kicked the contractor out.
Wow, so
Cool.
that's a whole different kind of infrastructure you are a specialist in now.
Absolutely. Well,
Yeah,
specialist, I don't know, but at least my experience is ramping up.
pretty impressive. Yeah.
This is actually the one of the final things that the contractor did. He put in the new rooms in the house and the floorings from which I continued the work.
Mm.
So to give you a bit of an impression, this was my attic 6 weeks ago, where I was really like insulating everything and putting plastic in it to keep the moist from getting into the roofing. And this is my attic a week and a half ago.
Wow.
Nice.
So blood, sweat, and tears are everywhere under that floor. So
Cool.
I recommend everybody to do at least one thing that is not computers besides your work. It keeps you sane and healthy.
Yeah, totally.
But I guess that's not why we're here. I'm just going to assume that your listeners don't like PowerPoint. So I'm just putting that away and I am opening the app
I think that's a fair
service.
assumption.
That's a fair assumption. So I have Visual Studio Code open here, and I created a fairly simple Bicep file. And if you're not familiar with Bicep, this is where you want to stop, do the 101 on Bicep, and then of course, come back. So this is a Bicep file that creates an app service plan or server farm, depending on when you started using Azure. You might know one or both of these terms. It's basically the compute abstraction that you can use to host app services. And an app service is managed IIS. Bit cringe, but that's what it boils down to. And then finally, on that app service, I have also specified some configuration, which we're going to work with later. Now, normally, when you want to deploy a template like this, you can do that in a number of ways. The first one is to start a deployment from the command line. And then you have to specify values for the 3 parameters at top. You don't always want to do that, especially when you want to deploy to multiple environments. You want to create a file, a parameter file, that defines the values for these parameters, one for test and one for production. And if you, for any reason, need more environments, you create files for those as well. Now, up to, I don't know, a year ago or so, you needed to specify those files still in JSON. And now there is a better way, namely Bicep parameter files. Let me show that to you. So I'm creating a new file. The first thing I'm going to do is save it, and I'm going to call it, without the use of any fantasy, demo.bicep param. Let me very quickly do this. Demo and then bicep param. Now a parameter file in Bicep is different in the first line already, because we're going to reference a file for which we are going to provide parameters. And here you see that again, I get help from the extension, Bicep extension for Visual Studio Code. So the file that I'm referencing is demo.bicep, which is in the same folder. And of course, I get a squirrely telling me, hey, that file declares a number of parameters. You don't specify values for them. And as a lazy developer, I press Ctrl dot, and then these parameters get generated for me. And now I have to specify values. So these have to be globally unique. I always mess up the quotes between all the different languages that we have. But here we have, the first one is a string, but the second one shouldn't be a string, it should be an object. So I still get squirrely braces of a squirrely telling me what I have to do. So let me update this to saying, hey, my first setting is going to be true. My second setting is going to be purple feature. And then number of purple thingies is of course 42. And now I can deploy this into Azure. And in the past you needed to reference both your template file and your parameter file for publishing into Azure. But you now don't need to anymore. You can just reference the parameter file. And as the parameter file references the template, you can deploy directly into Azure referencing only the parameter file. So let's do that. And of course, I first have to create a new resource group. And I'm going to do that in create -- location, West Europe. And I'm going to call it dotnetFlix. And looking forward, I'm going to call it dotnetFlix 01. And now I can say AZ deployment group create to the resource group dotnetFlix 01 in the location West Europe, and then my parameters demo.bicep param. And as always, I make mistakes. And what is wrong? It says I don't need a location, AZ deployment group create.
Yeah, I guess because the group already has location.
Well, actually, I think the deployment should have a location as well. And I know what's going wrong here. I have to go into do stuff. Let's try this again. And you will see me Googling commands probably during the demos, because for some reason, everything that can be looked up can't be remembered. There's just some kind of law behind it, I guess.
Law of physics.
I don't know, but it's because you can look it up so easily. It's like it doesn't care, or it doesn't matter if I remember it. I can look it up quicker, and then I can remember it, right?
I think it's the same with IntelliSense. As your IDE is suggesting things to you, you just stop remembering them what they are.
Yeah, what you saw me do with the quotes. I used the wrong type of quotes, and it tells me, and I know that I'm using the wrong kind of quotes, but still, I always keep doing it wrong the first time.
There's this nice terminal app on the Mac. It's called Warp. I think it's for PC 2, actually. But anyway, you can tell it vaguely what you want it to do, and then it will run it through a large language model, and it will figure out the exact commands.
Oh, wow.
So that's really convenient and kind of scary at the same time.
All right. And as you probably expected by now, if I go into my Azure environment and I open my resource group, .NETFlix, my app service plan and my app service are now created. It's not world shocking, but we got rid of the JSON parameter files. And the nice thing here is that I can now reference a file and I can skeleton my parameter file out, and I get helpful things, right? If I add something here that doesn't make sense, it will tell me that this, for crying out loud, that this parameter doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So that's a win.
So could you also add multiple using statements to this file to start multiple deployments, basically?
don't think so. Let's not do that. Param trollolol needs to be a string. And
it's already starting to complain, I think.
Oh, there we go. I should never have made a subfolder using try that.bicep. No,
It doesn't seem too happy.
It doesn't seem to have to. And I think one of the things that has been frequently asked is, hey, can we declare parameters in our parameter file that are not in our template so that we can create a parameter file that applies to 3 different templates?
Right.
If sometimes parameters are in 2 out of 3, and that makes your parameter file more reusable. But they said, no, you really should make your parameter files specific for every template. So that's probably the reason that this doesn't work. But of course, I'm just, trying to decompile what's happening in the Microsoft brains here. All right, let's move on to something else. So I'm going to remove this try that thingy, and I am going to go to my demo.bicep and show you something that a lot of developers do, but often turns out to be not very handy in the long run. What I did for my app service is that I need to specify a configuration. And that's that final resource here at the bottom. Now that resource actually takes an object with key value pairs that specify the configuration for your resource. Now many of those settings will probably come from your parameters. So one of the things that you might frequently catch yourself doing is something like setting 1 and then setting 1 value. Setting 2 value. And then you go here and say, well, that's not setting 1. So setting 1 value, that should be a string. And param setting 2 value, that's let's make that a bool. And of course, that gets very annoying when that list grows. So then a developer that's on the height of, I'm going to show you how smart I am, parable, is going to say, well, what if we just say, we're going to create a parameter. We're going to call it all settings, make a type object, and do this. And then I go to my parameter file, which will now have an error, and I say all settings equals, and then I put my settings here. And this works very well if you are one of few developers working on that infrastructure that is very familiar with what are valid keys for this object.
Yeah.
But if you put that infrastructure in place and you don't do anything with it because it's awesome, because we're awesome, but 6 months later, something has to change. Nobody knows what settings go into that object without looking into the application code. That is, of course, managed by another team, and we hate each other. What if we could declare a custom type that specified the key value pairs that I have to specify? And that's a thing that wasn't possible in Bicep until, I think, something like 9 months ago. We can do it now. We can create our own custom types. And that helps us solve this problem. Now, because watching me type isn't always very funny, I'm going to just paste this in here. There's a new keyword, which is called type. And then I specify the name of a type equals, and then between curly braces, all the keys that make up this type. So in my case, 3 settings. I can add things like a description, or for example, a minimum length annotation. Should be able to add a min length annotation here. There you go. So I can also add the annotations that you would normally add to a parameter to constrain which kind of values can go into an instantiation of this type. You see me here post-pending the word type to declare this as a type. That's not mandatory. And I normally don't give things a name that tells you what they are, what type they are. But doing this means that I can now still use the keyword my settings here for the value that I'm using. And now I can say, hey, I pass my settings here as the value because this is an object. And now I declare this of type my app settings type. And now I go here, and now I get error saying, hey, I changed the name again. I get warning saying, hey, you're now specifying keys here that are not part of the declaration of your My App Settings type. And even better, if I remove them, I get tab completion once again. So now, when somebody needs to change this file 6 months later, they get tab completion helping them providing the correct values for the different keys in the entry. So that are user-defined types. I think a great addition if you're working with larger infrastructures that span multiple files and that you're working on with multiple team members. Now, one question that probably comes up is, hey, the type that I'm using here, can I share that between multiple files? And the answer is yes. So I can create a new file. Let's call it my types.bicep. I'm going to take this type and move it into this file. Now, the first thing I need to do to make this reusable in other files is to mark it as exported. So there's an annotation at export. And I can now go into my demo.bicep file where I get an error saying, hey, I don't know what my app settings type is. I can say import and then delete star as. No, I don't need as. That's nonsense. I need this. My app settings type from my types.bicep, which again, I need to move in the same folder. Bum, bum, bum. Why is this not working? I'm pretty sure it's there.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there was a typo.
What did I... a capital. I think that was the mistake, right? All right, but it's fixed now.
Yeah, capital T, yeah.
Yeah, capital T. That's what you get from demoing live. People shouldn't do that. But if you're creating types that you want to reuse across multiple files or even multiple infrastructures, because there is nothing keeping you from moving this, for example, to another directory, and then including it from there. So you can make a general directory or a general location on your, server and reference that as well. So that are user-defined types and how you can use them to create your own types, preventing the anonymous object.
So do the, let's say I'm deploying, I don't know, a SQL Server in Azure. Do the SQL Server Bicep constructs, are they also marked as export? So for example, I could reuse some of the existing Azure Bicep types in my own param files?
You mean things like if I do resource my server of SQL/servers, and then West Europe, and there's probably something called properties.
Yeah.
And then this has a specific type.
Maybe even that properties object, so that I could just define that in my param file of the type server properties.
Not that I am aware of. Now, I can Google that for you on the fly if you want, but I don't know top of mind.
It's okay. We can figure it out and put it in the show notes.
Yeah, fair enough. I've never seen that being used. It's an interesting thought. It triggers something else. What I see people do very often is making templates that are very generic. So you have a template that says, I'm going to create a SQL Server and then SQL DB. And then they provide all the possible properties for SQL DB, and then they, as the value, they provide a parameter. So basically, they're creating their own file which specifies all the parameters that are also declared as parameters by the resource provider in Azure.
Yeah, so you've basically accomplished nothing except adding an additional layer.
What's the added value of that abstraction is my question.
Yeah.
If there are hard-coded requirements like TLS 1.2, or we are enforcing Entra-ID authentication over connection strings, if there are a number of baseline things in there, that might add value, but still limited value in my opinion, because there are better ways to enforce that. For example, Azure policy.
Another question, Henry.
Yeah,
can
sure.
I nest user-defined types? So can I use user-defined types in a user-defined type?
Yes.
I would imagine, but just prove it to me, please. I want to see
Make it compile.
Exactly. Make it work.
So this compiles. Nobody knows what it's doing, but it's going to compile. So I created a type that I'm now using as a property on my app settings type. So that's possible. And of course, now the next question, I'm going to do it for you. Is this going to work? Sorry, the other way around. So this is where it gets funny. And funnily enough, that's going to work as well. So there is no Stack Overflow happening or something in the compiler, apparently. All right, so let me remove this, because in 10 minutes, I'm going to struggle doing anything useful in these files. Yes. All right. I think we are back to something that's going to more or less compile. All right. Move to something else.
Yeah.
All right. So let me remove this.
Keep
one of the things. So one of the things that you might do is split your files into multiple files called modules, and especially when your infrastructure grows, and this goes on to 100, 200, 300, 25,372 lines, that actually makes sense. So one of the things that I can do is I can create a new file, and I can call it appservice.bicep. I can take this resource, which is the app service, move it into here, and then make it compile by saying, hey, I need a parameter location of type string. I need a param app service name of type string, and I need. So I can do two things now. I can say, hey, I need a server farm ID, which needs to be of type string. But I can also say I need a resource. No, I'm going to call it the parameter server farm, and it needs to be of type resource. And that resource needs to be of type Microsoft.web.serverfarms. I can even say version. Well, there you go. And okay, so now we're getting somewhere. This is still experimental, but I'm going to say, hey, I need a server farm to exist before I can deploy this app service onto that server farm. And of course, we're going to need this thing here as well. Then and we're going to need a param my app settings or my app settings type. So the only thing that's not working now is this resource for the server farm. And the way to get that working is by enabling an experimental feature. I'm going to create a new file, and everybody say a little bit, because it's going to be called bicep config.json.
Why?
Yeah, so precisely. Why? I don't know. But so moving on to that file, I just need to add one object, and there is a key, and it experimental features enabled. And here I can say enable all kinds of features that are still under development. So if you're interested in what the team is working on, this is where you need to go. Experimental features enabled, curly braces, control space. And there should be something like resource typed params and outputs here. And I'm going to enable this. And you already see the errors going away in my tabs, right? And now I can say, hey, to deploy my app service, I'm going to need a reference to a valid server farm. And I can now go back to my demo.bicep and say, hey, I want to deploy a module, and I'm going to call it app service module deployment. I need to reference a file, and that file is /appservice.bicep. What's going wrong here?
It must be in the folder. It's not in the folder.
Yeah, I think it's one level higher.
Okay, so now it's happy. There we go. So first of all, again, I love this extension because it's generating everything for me that I need. And it now says, hey, you need to specify a number of things. And of course,
so by the way, Henry, is that a separate extension, or is that just part of the Bicep extension?
It's part of the Bicep extension.
Oh, it's nice. Absolutely. I haven't seen it before.
Cool. What I'm doing here is, because normally you know what you're going to do. So you're going to do equal signs, curly braces, and then just enter into the curly braces object and probably going to control space.
Right, yeah.
You need to hold your horses, equal sign, required properties. That's what you're looking for.
That's nice.
So it's, I think, a template.
Cool.
I think I did a thing. Yeah, there you go. So this needs to be a string, and this needs to be a string. So I'm now using a custom type. Going to my module. Instead of specifying the values, I can also, of course, provide my app settings because it's the same type. And then finally, I have to provide a server farm, and that needs to be something of type Microsoft.web/server farms. For example, my app service plan. So now I'm passing a reference to that resource along, again, making my templates more readable. Great feature, if you ask me. Funny story, I never used it in a real world project. Sorry.
And just that's really nice. But I also noticed that when you set the experimental flag, you can also use this for output parameters, right?
Yes. So let's say I want to do something with that app service in this template as well. I go to my app service template, and I'm going to say I want to do an output of name my app service, and I'm going to make it a resource, and it's going to be of Microsoft web/sites. This works as well.
Yeah,
and
nice.
Of course, I need to be value needs to be my app service, and then I can reference it here. App service module.
It makes your Bicep files also more readable, but I also think, I can imagine, of course, I haven't seen it because I haven't used this feature yet, but I can also imagine that it speeds up your deployment, because I know that if you have a very large structure and you're working with IDs, you're doing the existing thing all over again in every file. Every time you have to find this resource by ID, and you have to actually find it. So I think that actually passing it along would be faster, but I'm not sure.
That's interesting.
Maybe the same thing happens under the covers. I don't know, but could be.
So what happens under the covers is, of course, your Bicep gets transpiled into JSON. Then your compiler cries a little and moves it on to the ARM REST API.
Yeah.
So all the smart things that are in Bicep are still compiled down to the Dumber JSON. So in JSON, you will probably still see something like this: resource ID.
Yeah.
So it's just syntactic sugar in the Bicep layer then.
Yeah.
Probably. Still nice though.
Okay. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think these two features, user-defined types and resource type parameters and outputs, bring more type safety to your templates.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And especially, for example, there are resources that have an ID, which is a property, which is, for example, a string, which is local to that resource provider, and then they have a resource ID. So if you take a resource ID, people can put in any random string and they will run into a deployment time error.
Yeah.
You can prevent that with resource typed parameters and outputs.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
So one of the things that I also wanted to show, and not necessarily because it's incredibly big, but it can be so handy, is user-defined functions. So for example, I can create my own functions using the func keyword, and then I'm going to say get URL. Let's not do get, generate URL. And I'm going to take a parameter, which is protocol, which is a string, a host name, which is a string, and then I don't know, the URL, which is also a string. Then I can now say the output of this function should once again be a string, and that should be protocol. Not all protocols work that way, but okay. Then my host name, then another slash, and then my URL. And why is this complaining? Of course, it should have an output type. There we go. So if in a number of locations in your file you need to generate URLs, you might run into this fiddling with, where do I need slashes? Do I have 2 slashes now? Do I have 0 slashes? Just putting that into a function can be a very convenient way for preventing that, and not having to do string interpolation all over the time, but just calling a function, which might be just a little bit more readable. I think it's a matter of taste. I rarely use this, but sometimes it can just... And another good reason for doing this is when you really want to encapsulate some logic and you don't want to spread it all over your template because you want to be able to change it in one location.
So, but is there, when you use these use-defined functions, is there a way to share them between different modules, different projects?
I don't know, but I wanted to try precisely the same thing. And this compiles.
You can just include them and then...
I know they have been talking about this.
I know for a fact that one of my teams just created a function for this name generator that used to be a shared module. So I think it's possible, but I'm not sure what the syntax is and how it works.
Nice. But that's that's a big improvement over using
totally
those modules for that.
Yeah. Because also you also run into this whole scope thing, right? Which is something that you need to really grasp when you do Bicep. That when you want to call something and you want to deploy something in another scope or another resource group or whatever, then you need to be sure that the scope is correct. And sometimes you have to call a submodule if you want to deploy something in a different scope. And that was also true for these kinds of things. And now you can just call the function and it's way better.
Nice.
Yeah, I feel the urge coming up to start drawing subscriptions and resource groups. But you're right. Scope is sometimes a little bit misunderstood. But if you don't use modules where you don't need to,
yeah, exactly.
I think it makes much more sense.
That's a good rule of thumb. Yeah.
All right. Yeah, let me quickly grab a template that I know is going to compile. Because I messed with this one so much. This should be function app.bicep. It's definitely not JavaScript. I used a module here. Okay, let's try another one. Never mind. New file. Storage account.bicep. Resource storage account of storage/storage accounts. Latest version is required properties. Name it globally unique. West Europe.
I really love your globally unique ID algorithm.
Well,
it's probably unique on Tessel, but globally, I'm not sure.
And I also understand now why West Europe is always at capacity, right?
Testing
proof of concepts of you.
So the problem is, let's share the pain. This is not as random as you might think, because if I do this 2 times or a number of times, it's very likely that they end up the same way. Okay, let's create a new resource group. Let's locate it in North Europe, just to satisfy Sander. And then what else does it need? It needs a name, I think, right? Flags. O2, because there is no better way for naming things. Now, what I now can do is, instead of creating a storage account, I can create a resource which is of type template spec, which contains the template with that storage account templated. That sounds very complicated, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see how it works in practice. So I'm going to say AZ and TS, which stands for a template spec. And then I'm going to say create, and the resource group that I'm going to use is dotnetFlix 02. And it needs a location because it's a resource in itself, which is going to be North Europe, just for messing with everybody. And of course, the templates file that I'm going to deploy, which is storage account.bicep. And I don't really know anymore at this point. So let's see what else we need. It needs a name, like any resource. So let's call it storage account. And I think it's going to need a version, which actually can be a free form string. So let's do 1.0. Okay, that was blazingly fast. So let's go into Azure, refresh my list of resource groups, have another one. And there is this thing with template specs. Deploying the first one, it takes about 30 seconds to a minute for it to show up. But once you have deployed one, and you're going to add number 2 and number 3, they are instant. So there is something behind the scenes that for some reason it takes a while before the first template spec shows up. But I've babbled for long enough. Here it is. It's another resource, and I can open it. I can see it can have multiple versions. In this case, we have 1.0. And when I click it, I can even see the template. So this is the downside of template specs right now. The JSON template is stored, not the Bicep template. And the reason for that is that the ARM engine still works with the JSON template. Bicep is syntactic sugar in front of ARM, at least right now. Who knows? Now, the question that comes up is, why would I do this? So there are a lot of scenarios where you might want to publish templates that others can use. And you might do that using things like artifact feeds or a Bicep registry, which is basically a container registry. But if the consumer of those templates is not necessarily well versed in infrastructure, template specs are a rather easy way for them to find those template specs in the portal, or you can teach them a little bit of CLI, and then they can deploy the template spec to instantiate resources they need. An example that I've seen is, for example, data engineers. They are tech savvy. They know their way around Databricks and other things like that I don't know anything about, but they need the Databricks instance to be up and running when they need it, but they also want to remove it when they don't need it anymore. So they need a means to provision it for themselves. So let's give them a template spec, because a template spec, if you don't want to use the CLI, you can just deploy it from the portal. Another thing that we would do, probably, but for some user groups, this is a very good alternative for having to bug a system administrator every time they need a resource.
And I guess that if your Bicep file has some custom parameters, that you can set them here as well during this deployment step?
Let's see for ourselves. Let's say that I want to do something like a name post fix, which needs to be a string, and it has to have a max length of 3. Then I have 21 left here, so that's enough. Then I add the name post fix. Of course, there can be a dash here. Now I can publish this, and let's do something silly. Republish it as version 1. And it will warn me that you're overwriting a version, which is generally not a good idea as soon as somebody is consuming that version, right? So let's say thank you CLI, and move it to 2.0. And if I now go back into the portal I refresh my list of versions. We have a version number 2. If I now go to deploy it, I can specify a name postfix.
Nice. Cool.
Anything else you want to know about template specs?
No.
Not me.
Yeah, I'm very curious about deployment stacks also because I've heard good things about them, but I haven't used them myself yet.
All right. Okay, so let's start with a problem. When you are deploying resources in Azure, you can use ARM or Bicep templates to define the state of resources that you need. You can, and then the resources are created, or if their properties deviate, they are updated to match what you describe in your template. One of the things that ARM wasn't really good at was keeping track of the resources that you created in your template, and then automatically also removing resources in Azure that are no longer in your template. So cleaning up after yourself. A thing that Terraform, for example, does better using its state file. Now you might be thinking there is a deployment mode, complete mode. So when you deploy to a scope in Azure, let's say a resource group, you deploy a template into a resource group, you can specify -- mode complete. And what that will do, it will look at your template, and after creating or updating all the resources, it will look at your deployment scope and remove all the resources that are not in your template. Well, I say all, but it's more or less all, because there are a number of resources in Azure that didn't start out as a resource. For example, alert rules or airbag assignments. And when this complete mode was introduced, they weren't included in the cleanup because they weren't resources. And then all of a sudden, they became full-fledged resources of themselves. And they didn't want to change the behavior of the complete mode. So now complete mode is cleaning up more or less most of your resources when you use it.
Good name then.
Yeah, awesome naming them.
So it's neither correct nor complete. And another problem is that it doesn't look at resources that you deployed from your context, for lack of a better word. It looks at what's in the template versus what's in the deployment scope.
Yeah.
And if you adhere closely to the guideline of using a single resource group only for one workload and using only one infrastructure deployment for one workload, that will work out fine. But if, for example, 2 teams or 2 people both deploy resources to the same resource group, for example, an infrastructure layer and an application layer, and they start using the complete mode, they start throwing out each other's stuff.
Yeah.
So
does complete mode also support a subscription scope? Because that could end up with some nice situations.
I never used a complete mode after my first trials 9 years ago, when ARM was just released, and we still called it the new Ibiza portal. I don't know if you can remember that. And everybody said, "What's this horizontal scrolling thing and this blade? What's happening here? It's weird."
Blades. Yeah.
Sorry?
These Xbox blades.
Sorry, I don't know what an Xbox is.
Oh, the Xbox had, I should say, the same kind of user interface.
Ah, okay, so maybe there's a link there.
Let's keep that for another episode then.
I tried to make fun of older Microsofties when I was in Seattle about this horizontal scrolling by putting up a mouse and saying, "Why do you think this wheel goes up and down?" and it hit me back.
Maybe you're holding the mouse wrong.
They all turned their Surface thingies around and they start swiping from left to right, and I felt really, really dumb. True story. So complete mode, a complete failure. I think now, or very soon in the documentation, you will find a hint to look at deployment stacks instead. So let's see what they do. So what we're going to do is we're going to run through a number of scenarios where we're going to deploy something into Azure as a deployment stack. So let's say I have a deployment scope in Azure, which is empty, a resource group. And I'm going to deploy a template containing 2 of my favorite resources, an app service and a SQL DB, and I'm going to mark it as a deployment stack. Then the end result in Azure will look like this. There will be a virtual box around these resources, marking them as a stack, a deployment stack. And when I come around once again, and let's say in Azure there is now an app service already, and again I deploy a template with that app service and a SQL DB, you will end up with what you probably expect in Azure, that SQL DB is deployed and added to the stack, but that stack also accumulates that app service that's already there, but it was defined as part of the template. It gets a little bit more interesting when we start talking about updating. Let's now say that I feel that it's a good idea, or I felt like in the past it was a good idea to also have a virtual machine. Virtual machines aren't a good idea, but let's say we still had that belief in the past. In Azure, I now have a stack containing an app service, a SQL DB, and a virtual machine. Then I come to my census, and I create a template with just an app service and a SQL DB, and I deploy that into Azure. What now happens is that in Azure, that stack is shrunk to only contain the app service and the SQL DB. And the virtual machine is still referenced in the stack, and it's going to be called a detached resource. So you can start scanning your stacks for detached resources, and viewing detached state is more or less like recycle binny, and then look at those resources, see if you really don't need them anymore, and if you don't, remove them. Let's say you want to go one step further. There is a parameter that you can give to deploying a deployment stack, which is called -delete resources. So if we run through the same scenario, in Azure we have an app service, a SQL DB, and a virtual machine. And we're going to deploy that template, which contains just the app service and the SQL DB. What will happen is that in Azure, that virtual machine will now be deleted. Not because it's part of the deployment scope, but because it's part of the stack that we're now redeploying. Does that make sense?
Makes sense.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
I like the default being the recycle binny type option. Yeah.
It's less, as you say that politely, screw up
Yep.
likely.
Yeah.
Yes. And before you ask, there are alternatives as well to delete resource groups. So when you can also deploy a deployment stack to a subscription, and then, for example, create resource groups, and you can specify delete resource group behavior as well. And the resource groups, they get really interesting, because what if you have created a resource group with a number of resources from a stack, and then somebody else comes in and puts extra resources in that resource group, and then you remove that resource group as part of your stack, but 4 out of 5 resources in that resource group are not part of the stack. So there are a number of flags there for dealing with those kind of scenarios as well, but they're pretty niche.
So where is all this state stored about what's in the stack?
In Azure, in the Azure Resource Manager, and I'll show you in a bit where you can find it in the portal.
Do you know, does it also use that state to maybe improve performance a bit when you are deploying a new version of your stack?
I wouldn't know, honestly.
Because that's something I always miss in Bicep, you know. And I started working with Pulumi a while ago, and that is a very nice feature of, hey, you are trying to deploy some new things, but I also know that I've already deployed the other 88 things in your file, so I'm not going to even try to deploy them again because I know they're already there. And with Bicep, everything is always, okay, let's just try to deploy it. It's idempotent, and we'll see if it works or not, but that takes time, of course. So I feel like Terraform and Pulumi are usually way faster because of that state file. Would be nice if, you know, the deployment stacks could be an answer for that performance problem as well.
It's something like a bit of a pruning what they do, right? They decide upon themselves what needs to be changed. The problem is that doesn't help you overcoming things like configuration drift. So if you still have old school people going into the portal, and that's what Bicep and ARM templates will do. People that still go into the portal to, for example, scale resources up and down instead of going through the infrastructure as code, they will get really tired of scaling up the app service 25 times a day because the people keep deploying the actual configuration out of source control. So they will learn to use infrastructure as code. And that's what I believe is a benefit of always deploying everything to make sure that the actual state matches your desired state.
Yeah.
And of course, ARM also does some of the calculations and the inference that Pulumi and Terraform do on their own. It just does it on the server.
Yeah.
And it's not in the ARM engine. It's going to be the individual resource providers. The resource providers that they are responsible for parts of the individual resource types.
Mm-hmm.
And they get the desired state of a resource, and they know the actual state of the resource because they manage it. And they can do that comparison and say, no changes needed, moving on.
Right.
So they can short circuit there as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and in my experience, some of them are pretty fast for some types of resources, and other resources can be pretty slow.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if you do 25 of them, the first 3 will succeed, and the others will say, what is 429? Ho, ho, ho. Take it easy. And then you will hit the retry of ARM 1 minute later, and then 3 more will go on. Not every resource provider is as good as the other one.
It's just like real software.
Yep.
Yes. Just imagine that you're responsible for ARM and you have to talk to, I think, hundreds of teams by now about how they need to improve their resource providers. I don't envy that person. Going back to template stacks of deployment stacks, there is one more interesting feature that I want to point out, and that it is possible to deploy to lock a stack. So, there is a very typical scenario for that. So let's say that I'm working in an application team, and I have my my resource group where I'm going to deploy my resources. Let's say an app service and a SQL DB. And being a little bit security conscious as I am, I want to attach those to a private network and make sure that my SQL DB can only be accessed by my app service. And if I want to access it myself, I want to do it over the private network of the company. So the problem that I'm going to hit here is that I don't want to create just my own virtual network between these two resources. I need to connect it to the central network. And there is probably some kind of workplace administrator that is a little bit zealous about what gets connected to its virtual network and what isn't. So there needs to be a way for them to provide connectivity for me, but keep control over what I can do with that connectivity. So they have a central resource group where there is a VNet as well. Let's call it the hub, if you know about hub and spoke architecture.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to have 2 private endpoints for my app service and my SQL DB that I want to connect to a network. Well, a spoke network. And that spoke should be paired to the hub.
Yeah.
Now the center part, I can deploy using a deployment stack, along with some routing and maybe some identity and other things that I need for example, DNS. And then I can deploy from the central team that deployment stack into the scope of the application team. And they can now connect to the virtual network and they can use it and they can create subnets, for example. But they cannot change the configuration of that VNet. They cannot change forwarding rules, and they cannot change, for example, the routing table if I include it as part of the stack, and I lock that stack. So this is a way for providing things into another scope, giving people access to that scope, but then locking them out of the stack again. And this feature is going to replace blueprints, which have been in preview, I think, for 700 years.
Forever.
A long time, yeah.
Yeah, they're not going to make GA. They're going to be deprecated and then desupported.
Yeah.
You want to see it in action?
Yeah, sure.
Let's see if we can make that work. Let me very quickly. Yeah. Okay, so I still have this storage account thing going on here. Let me remove the parameter and let's give it a name, which is unique this time using my right hand, 001. And I'm going to create a new, why is this tab completion thing not working? AZ group create, control spatie? No. AZ group create -- location, West Europe, name dotnetFlix 03. And what I'm now going to do is, instead of doing AZ deployment group create, I'm going to say AZ stack group create. The name is going to be dotnetFlix stack. And then I'm going to deploy it to a resource group called dotnetFlix 03. And let's see what else I need to add. Of course, I need to add my template file, and that is called storage account dot bicep. And I need to specify the deny settings. So that's the locking. I can specify deny delete, and I can specify deny delete write, and I can specify none. And let's do that, because I don't want to lock myself out from removing this later today. And this is the thing that can actually happen. So what I now do is I create a stack in that resource group, and in that stack I create a resource with this fancy name.
Right.
So I go back to the portal, resource groups, dotnetFlix number 3. Where are my storage accounts? Okay. There, oh, I already clicked the wrong button. I wanted to go here to the deployments. That's successful. And now my storage account has made it through the cache. So here's my storage account. I can now find deployment stacks in the menu on the left. And this is, of course, the first improvement. It is possible to deploy multiple stacks to the same resource group, to the same scope. And we had the dotnetFlix stack. And in that stack, we can see that the account Lukulule001 is included. What I can now do, I can go back to my template and I can update the name of this resource to 002 and redeploy my stack. And it's going to say, hey, this is not the first time you're deploying it. Be cautious, you might be detaching resources. And of course, I'm going to continue with that because I'm confident. And of course, I said, I'm going to change the name. That's the thing you will people here say, but that's not true. The name of a resource is part of the ID of the resource. So I'm actually specifying a new resource. And you would normally see that by the second resource popping up in Azure next to the existing one. For people obsessing over names and redeploying their templates a number of times, they're going to ramp up a high number of resources over time if they don't clean up after themselves. If I go back, I now see that this new resource 002 is managed by the stack, and that my other resource is now in a detached state. Nice. And it will stay in that state until the next deployment of the stack. It's not retained there forever. And now, of course, I know you have all kinds of questions, but I want to very quickly do this and say dash delete resources. No. Wrong argument. And what's not helping is that this has been changed quite a lot during the previews. Oh, dash delete resources. Yes, I am confident. And now, to wrap up this demo, what do you think that will happen?
So the detached one will be deleted for sure, I would guess. So the number 2, I'm not sure if it's going to be deleted or it's going to be in the detached state. I kind of hope it's going to be detached. What do you think, Edwin?
Probably, yeah. I think that will happen, yeah.
Okay, so if I understand this correctly, the detached resource is going to be removed from the stack because there is a new deployment coming in.
Right.
But it's going to be retained in Azure because right now I am deleting resources that are no longer deployed part of the stack that I'm deploying. But it wasn't part of the stack already. It wasn't managed by the stack anymore, so it's not going to be deleted. So resource 1 is going to stay in Azure
sense.
and out of the stack.
Yeah.
Resource number 2, currently managed by the stack, not part of the new deployment of the stack. So it's going to be removed from Azure.
Detached.
Yeah.
No, removed from Azure because I specified
Resources.
delete resources.
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah,
So
yeah,
it will not detach. Detach is basically the
yeah.
default behavior if you don't delete.
Yeah.
And then, of course, resource number 3 is going to be in the stack. Okay.
I think this is probably also what you want.
Yes, you're probably not going to switch. You're probably not going to switch between detached and between detaching and deleting.
No.
And originally, the behavior was part of the stack, but now it's part of the deployment. There has been a long debate, but this is how it turned out.
Yeah, that makes sense. I would have hoped, though, that in the detached scenario, you could have your, basically infinite detach, right? So if I'm stupid enough to remove something from my Bicep script and deploy that, it's going to be in the detached state. But if I'm additionally stupid and I deploy again 5 minutes after that, I still lose that resource.
The thing is, if so, in your words, if somebody does 2 stupid things in a row, you definitely don't want adverse effects, right?
No.
Maybe even less than when somebody makes a mistake once. The thing is, these are properties of the state of the stack. What I would love is for a resource to have a property part of the following stack, not part of a stack, because then I can use the resource graph to query all the resources that are not part of the stack and start shouting at teams. From a architect or infra
from your ivory
point
tower.
of view. Your words. Yes, absolutely. If somebody can get me an ivory tower, because I absolutely don't have one.
Or you could make them part of a stack by deploying a stack with those resources in it, right?
Yes, because it will absorb the resources. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So this is what I expected as the state of the stack. And if I go into the resource group itself, we see that resource number 1 is retained because it was not managed by the stack when I deployed using -- delete resources. I do like to babble about this a bit longer, but I think we are really pushing time now.
Yeah, we are.
Yeah. So that's all I wanted to show.
Yeah. Cool. Well, let's wrap things up. I think it's really useful, deployment stacks, and overall I enjoyed all the new things that you showed us, because I haven't used Bicep in a couple of months, and this is all new to me. So thank you very much for that. I believe you've also written a book, right, about infrastructure as code?
It's once you start going down that route, people start asking you to do other things. So I've done a lot in the space, but yes, I've written a book. And shameless plug, I very recently released a course on Pluralsight, a couple hour long course on infrastructure as code, mostly using Bicep as well. So if you don't like reading, but like watching videos instead, which might be the case if you stayed with us all the time, that's available to you as well.
Cool. We'll add a link in the show notes. If you can share that, then I will add it.
Absolutely.
Cool. So Henry, once again, thank you so much for this very nice update.
Yeah, thanks
for being our guest. And to those watching, please like this episode, subscribe to the channel. It helps us out a lot. And we'll see you at the next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.